Hello, everyone. On behalf of the World Affairs Council of Austin, I welcome you all to another collaborative effort with Kozmetsky Center of Excellence in Global Finance at St. Edward's University. After our guest speaker's presentation, we'll open up the roundtable for you to ask your questions directly around 12:30 p.m. Now, I am so pleased to ask our partner and the esteemed director of the Kozmetsky Center, Dr. Cheryl Cross, to say a few words about today's program. Dr. Cross, if you would take the microphone, please.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to President of the World Affairs Council, Austin Mortada Mohammed, and to you, Ben, serving as Vice President and managing a lot of the organization of these sessions, and to our senior intern from St. Edward's University, specializing in global business, Rania Lewis. I think we're off to a terrific start with this forum. It couldn't be more timely. We have so many challenges and opportunities today in our global community, and I think the idea of bringing the dynamic Austin community and private sector together with students that are interested in global business, policy, regional studies, area studies, and creating this opportunity to be able to speak with professionals who have spent decades, in many cases, working globally and internationally to share their experience with the students is truly invaluable. It's taking the experience in the classroom to another level of the real world and helping to prepare our students to more effectively navigate and manage, and most of all, to contribute in our 21st century global community. And I'm delighted today to welcome our speaker, Mel Sanderson. Mel has a tremendous global experience and international professional background. She's served as in the United States Foreign Service in the Congo and throughout other areas of the world community. She also served as Vice President of Global Operations for Freeport, McMoRan, formerly Phelps Dodge Corporation, Mining Corporation in the Congo, which I'm interested to learn more about because it's a challenging environment. It takes a lot, and it's her emphasis that prior to much of the discussion on the national scale, where we're turning increasingly to looking at the importance of diversity, inclusivity, empathy in the workplace. Mel was talking about this. She recognizes these variables and cites these factors as being critical, along with intercultural communication and her capacity to work overseas in Africa and elsewhere in the world. So we have with us a seasoned expert on Africa and international global business. Since retiring from Freeport McMoRan, she continues her service in the international area, working as chair of the Arizona District Export Council and with the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations. And she is serving as president of Mel Sanderson Consulting, offering support for expanding business operations, investment operations throughout the continent of Africa. So Mel, thank you so much for being with us today and for contributing to our series on global investment, finance, emerging markets, and political risk, sponsored by the Kozmetsky Center of St. Edward's University, together with the World Affairs Council of Austin. And Mel, the Zoom floor is yours. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you both for having invited me to speak today. Before everyone joined the call, I was just saying how prescient the Kozmetsky Center and the World Affairs Council were, because this theme was determined back in September. And we see today how many more people are talking about the importance of empathy in a life context and in a business context and a political context. I think that we've seen play out across the arc of history in our country that when politicians are capable of empathy, it makes a profound difference for the political success of our country. And I want to start there. I want to start with the difference between sympathy and empathy, because both are important, but both come from a different place. Sympathy is the capacity of understanding what another person is going through, largely because one has experienced it oneself, or it's such a universal that it's understood. Good example is the death of someone who is a close family member. Even if that hasn't happened to you personally, you understand that that is a very grave emotional blow. And therefore you can sympathize with that person and what you understand them to be feeling. Empathy, however, is a form of emotional understanding that transcends experience. And that is what makes it both precious and rare. It's very hard to teach empathy because it's not an intellectual experience. It's a truly emotional experience. But what I would say about empathy is that it is absolutely foundational to a successful life and also to business success or to professional success. As Cheryl mentioned, I spent 21 years in the Foreign Service, and I had the privilege of serving our country in Latin America, East and West Europe, and finally in Africa. And you know, it's very, comparatively speaking, it's very much easier to empathize with cultures with whom we share a common basis. So it's understood that we have shared values. And therefore, it's easier to empathize with a German man or a Polish woman, because we can put ourselves in those shoes much more easily than we can in my cultural background to put myself in the shoes of an African man or woman or an Oriental man or woman, because I haven't lived that cultural shared value. So I would argue that one way to improve empathetic skills is to become familiar with one's own cultural background. And that includes, you know, your genealogy. So I have a very boring genealogy. I'm 98% Irish and English. But in studying my genealogy and studying my family members, I became aware of how unconsciously, how much of that I carry around with me. And there's much discussion these days about unconscious bias, unconscious racism. And that's the negative side of what I'm talking about. That's the anti-empathy aspect, you could say, because there is such a thing. There is the refusal to be empathetic to others. And part of that can also stem from exactly these same cultural experiences and values that I'm referring to now. And that's why it's important to understand that we all have those. We can't escape them. And we need to understand how they shape us and how they shape our interactions with the world. In the Foreign Service, empathy was considered to be a very valuable characteristic. And I have to say that I think I demonstrated it fairly early on in my career and was rewarded by the State Department for that particular skill set in my promotions and in the kinds of positions that I was given. But I would say that in the business world, and I know that several of you are in studying to enter the business world specifically. In the business world, it's not always valued as highly. In the mining industry in particular, empathy is a great example of what's called, rather demeaningly, a soft skill. And soft skill usually means woman's work. When you look across the mining industry, you see that to this day, the engineers, who of course sit at the top of that particular industrial segment heap, the majority of the engineers are still men, because that's who gets hired. It isn't that the schools aren't graduating female mining engineers, it's that it's exponentially harder for a woman female engineer to be hired into a mining company. It comes back to that unconscious bias, right? We tend to be empathetic towards those who look like us or share a gender with us or who we perceive to share values with us. Another way of putting it is the old boys club or the old girls club. To be fair, we have old girls clubs too. So coming back to the mining industry, what you tend disproportionately to find women doing are the functions of corporate social responsibility. And why is that? Because those functions actually require a higher degree of empathy. The functions of corporate social responsibility are government relations, social relations, and public relations. Notice the common word in all three of those functions, relations. It's about relationships with others, building, maintaining relationships based on trust, based on the demonstrated capacity that you have shown to be honest, the integrity, therefore, that can be confided in. And the industry as a whole, again, there are exceptions. There's always exceptions within individual companies. But for the industry as a whole, CSR activities are regarded as important, but not essential. They are support functions for the company, because what the company is there to do is to dig up rocks, process rocks, and turn rocks into something useful. And the so-called social license to operate, which is what the CSR activities are aimed at securing, is a nice thing to have, but the mine will operate without it. That's the general prevailing attitude. I think it's changing. I think that more and more there's talk within the industry of elevating the importance of CSR, of recognizing that no, the mine just doesn't get to continue operating if the people of a country really don't want it there. And there are numerous examples of that. There's several ongoing before the COVID in Peru, for instance, where indigenous tribes near a mine site, not companies, a different company, had mobilized very successfully to cut the road so that the mining company could not export its product. Mine can't operate if you can't export. You can't just stockpile your product. So suddenly, social license began to matter a lot more. Coming back to the Foreign Service, I joined the mining company from my position at the American Embassy in Kinshasa. And I had spent 3 years immediately post-war. Congo had suffered Africa's worst conflict. It was called Africa's World War, with 9 different countries fighting it out inside the borders of Congo. And entering that country immediately post-war was an experience that stretched my empathy to the breaking point. Because my job was to make sure that I built relationships with all of the leading political figures and all of the former warring factions. In many cases, that meant building a professional relationship with someone who had been accused of human rights atrocities and had been placed into a position of political power and influence, and therefore were untouchable for the actions of which they were accused. And I bring that up specifically because sometimes empathy is not possible. I had no reasonable basis to empathize with an individual who had engaged in those sorts of acts. I could understand them intellectually in the context of war, and I could understand them intellectually in the context of law, but I could not connect emotionally with that individual. And that is the heart of empathy, is to make that emotional connection. Upon that emotional connection, we travel those bridges of trust and integrity and mutual confidence and respect. And I couldn't build that bridge. So I don't want to make it sound as though empathy is always possible or that empathy is always desirable. It's extremely important, and as I said at the beginning, vital to a good life, and a very important tool in your toolbox in both a business sense and a political sense, but it's not always possible. Empathy on a political level is essential for the diplomatic life, in case any of you might be interested in the diplomatic life. Because again, when we're using words like trust and integrity, you have to be able to have that emotional connection. I'll give you a concrete example, coming back again to the Congo, because it's an ideal example. I noticed very early living in the Congo, of course, I was dealing on a political level, I was dealing exclusively with men. There were no women in the post-war Congolese government. After the elections, we did see women in government, but the post-war government was a transitional government established by outside forces to bring and maintain peace. And so it was all men. And as I got to know these men better, I realized a couple of things. Number one, that post-war, Congolese society's respect for women had been deeply reduced. The kinds and the volume of atrocities committed against women in the Congo had eroded a lot of the traditional respect that the culture had for women, the role of women, all of the work of women. Because throughout Africa, that tends to be a very respected role. To be a mama is a title of honor. But in the Congo, as I say, post-war, that had been very deeply eroded. And the second thing I noticed was, I knew that I had really managed to establish an emotional connection with one of the men when I was invited to their home, because that meant meeting their wife. And it was a very interesting dynamic once I got to the home, trying to then connect with my fellow female, for whom I felt an instinctive empathic connection, while their husband is standing by and basically trying to keep her in her place. Another example of this cultural tendency of keeping someone in their place. When the company, when Freeport was first establishing itself in the Congo and doing its initial hiring of local individuals. I was with the team that went around to the villages in our concession. And one of the reasons I was there was to make sure that women got jobs, even if they weren't going to be jobs as engineers, even if they were jobs cooking in the kitchen at the commissary. I wanted to make sure that women were getting some of those jobs. And when I got to one village, and the chief looked at me with great disapproval, and he said, "Madame, women do not work for mining companies." And I smiled sweetly at him, and I said, "Excuse me, sir, with all due respect, our company intends to offer to women the opportunity to work in our company if they so desire, if they so choose." Because my empathetic connection was for those women who had all these possible new opportunities, because it doesn't sound like much to us to say, oh, you're one of the cooks in the kitchen at the commissary. But when you're living in a remote African village where previously you had no employment whatsoever and no income of your own, and were entirely dependent upon the generosity of your husband for every moment of your life, that's a huge thing to say that you have a job. And my empathetic connection was totally there, because when I got my first job out of college, I felt instantly that sense of control and empowerment and confidence. And that carried me forward through my life and shaped me in a lot of ways. And I could see that change. I could feel that change happening for a lot of those Congolese women. And I knew it was going to affect the way that they talked to their daughters about possibilities. This is the power of empathy. When empathy extends its hand and provides new opportunities, when empathy can see where a future can be different than a past, empathy can be the great agent of change in our world, in a business context, in a political context, in a life context. We talked today about the importance of recognizing diversity of all sorts, whether it's in sexual orientation, whether it's in racial orientation. It all starts with empathy. That's what we saw with George Floyd. It was an explosion of empathy. I read a quote from one of the mothers in Seattle who said, "When I read that he was calling out for his mother, how could I not feel that? How could I not be here today?" That epitomizes the power of empathy to mobilize change across whole societies. And sadly, the George Floyd incident also demonstrates what I referred to earlier as the anti-empathy. The police officers who apparently thought it was funny to kill someone. And it's important to be aware that that anti-empathy exists in societies and in humans. Coming back to my experience that I mentioned with the high-ranking Congolese political official who was accused of atrocities, definitely anti-empathetic. And I found him to be exactly that way in our personal reactions. It was 100% clear that he had nothing but disdain, not just for me, but for most people around him, and seemed to be completely lacking in human connectivity, which of course was what enabled the actions of which he was accused. It's exactly the same thing which enabled the police officers to behave as they did. So we see why it is of such urgency that we promote and develop empathy. That empathetic connection makes it easier for US businesses to succeed abroad, because when you understand your market, you will thrive in your market. This is a basic sales principle. You need to know your customer. But a lot of times what's meant by know your customer is exactly that empathetic connection. A good salesman knows that his key client has 3 kids and one of them has a disability. And that good salesman never fails to acknowledge that. How is, let's just say, your daughter? How is your daughter doing? Is everything going well? What about your other kids? So it's a key component in business success, particularly in other cultures as well as in our own. It's a key element in political success. As I mentioned earlier, as you look across the arc of history, and not just in America, but around the world, you find that the most charismatic individuals have a high degree of empathy. I'll give you a concrete example. When I was in the Foreign Service and I was stationed in Madrid, it was during Bill Clinton's presidency. And he and Hillary came often to Madrid because they had formed a personal friendship with the King and Queen of Spain. And because the ambassador at the time liked me so much, he gave me the honor of being the control officer for the president and for the first lady when they would visit. And I was immediately struck by Bill Clinton, because I had heard all this stuff about, oh, this incredible memory, et cetera, et cetera. It's not so much memory. Bill Clinton was a deeply empathetic individual. He was 100% with you when he was in front of you, even if it was just for a handshake at the airport to say thanks for everything you did. He was 100% with you. And how do I know this? The first time that I met him, he was actually passing through Madrid, literally at the airport. The king just came out to say hi, and Bill was on his way elsewhere. And he saw me 2 years later in a different context, and he said, I met you before, didn't I? My goodness, nobody like me? Really? I should be so empathetic. But anyway, I want to stop there because what I would love to do is to turn this into more of a discussion. And obviously, I'm willing to answer any questions that anybody has. Thank you.
Okay, Melissa, thank you so much for sharing your perspective on the issue, importance of empathy in global business, foreign service. We have a number of attendees here, so I think we can use maybe we can open the chat function just if you'd like to ask questions, and then we'll just open it up to you. If you just could indicate that you have a question in the chat, that would be, I think, sufficient.
Everyone is stunned into silence. Either that or I was so immensely boring that everyone's asleep.
Branya, do you want to start?
Of course. So my question for you is, as many of our attendees are upperclassmen students who are looking to take the first steps needed to find the future career, what do you believe is necessary for students to know or do for a career in foreign service?
Okay. So
Mel, before you start, okay, good. I just was going to ask son, please, could you please make sure your microphones are muted, and we'll come to you if you have questions. That'll help with the entire sound in the session. Mel, please.
So the Foreign Service is a very particular beast. with a very particular process. So to become a Foreign Service officer, you have first to pass a written examination. And the exam is offered twice a year, not on a fixed date, but you can find the dates by visiting www.state.gov. Once you pass the written exam, you then have to pass an oral exam, which takes place in front of a board of people like myself, composed of retired Foreign Service officers and also some active Foreign Service officers. And once you've done that, you pass the security check, the health check, and then you're in the Foreign Service as a non-tenured officer. So you then have 2 assignments as a non-tenured officer that one will be in the consular domain and another will be in one of the other functional areas of the State Department. And as long as you perform well in those 2 assignments, you will become a tenured Foreign Service officer with a nice career ahead of you. So I guess that because that's such a particular process, my advice would be to start by finding out when the written exam is being offered. And also there are a lot of study materials on the web. I have 2 friends here who are in the process of getting into the State Department this way. And they used those study materials and found them to be really effective. So that's why I bring it up. We didn't have that stuff when I took the test.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question, if I may.
Absolutely.
Right. First of all, Ms. Sanderson, thank you so much for a great presentation, and we all need the skills, the empathy skills that you just highlighted in your presentation. Now, let me turn on my camera here so you could get to see me. You served in Congo, and it's and sub-Saharan Africa in general. And it's an area most businesses, whether in Texas, the US in general, we look at as more of a high risk area. And if you have an update for us on any change in the landscape of the geopolitical issues, and also looking at the report from the State Department about the potentials, and also Commerce Department on the potential in Congo in terms of the need for infrastructure, and also understanding the fact that Congo is more of a landlocked country, which makes really the supply chain part of it is really challenging. So what do you say today regarding the business opportunities in that part of the world in terms of risk, prospects, and future outlook? I know it's a very loaded question, but I appreciate your kindness of answering it.
Oh, I'm never afraid of a loaded question. Thank you. So you asked about an update in terms of the geopolitics of the Congo. I'll start on the macro scale and work back to the micro scale. Post-war, Congo has not done a particularly good job of reestablishing full relations with its neighbors. So, for instance, you still can't travel, you cannot fly directly from the Congo to Rwanda, or the Congo to Uganda, or the Congo to Sudan, or the Congo to Cameroon. You can fly to Angola, but that's because Angola was an ally to the Congo in the war. The countries that I named were aggressor countries towards the Congo during the war. So there's been very little progress in that aspect of the geopolitical landscape. And because of that, there are economic consequences as well. Congo's economic rebound is slow. But before I go there, as I promised, coming back to the micro level, Congo's most recent election was disputatious. In all probability, a candidate named Martin Fayulu actually won that election, but he is not president. A gentleman named Etienne Tshisekedi is president, in large part because the officially outgoing president, Joseph Kabila, wanted Etienne Tshisekedi to be president. And Mr. Kabila has remained an extraordinarily significant figure behind the scenes of the Tshisekedi government, which has led to a lot of disillusionment for potential investors into the Congo. Because coming now to your question about risk and perceptions, especially the Kabila regime was regarded as highly corrupt and extraordinarily unreliable in terms of honoring contracts and agreements. So the continued influence exerted indirectly by Joseph Kabila over the current government is what is keeping investment from coming into the Congo. You're absolutely right. Infrastructure is urgently needed in Congo. It has never been rebuilt following the war. I had a friend who talked about driving his Volkswagen Beetle all the way from Kinshasa in Western Congo, all the way across to Lumumbashi in the southeast of Congo. And that was back in 1950. You could do that in 1950. You can't do that today because that road that used to link the country as one of many, just like our system of roads, was cut during the war and never rebuilt. One thing I would correct you on, Congo is not a completely landlocked country. It has a port, the port city of Matadi, on a strip of ocean frontage 18 miles wide. So not completely landlocked. They do have a port. But the port itself is in dilapidated condition and therefore has not contributed substantially to the economic regeneration of the country. For the last 12 years, Congo's been trying to attract investors to a large hydroelectric project, and particularly in our age of renewable energy, you would think that would be very enticing, but a succession of investors, even including the Chinese, have found it virtually impossible to deal with Congo's politics, and that project has not been realized either. So bottom line, Congo remains the land of great potential, but is not living up to its potential yet.
Okay. That's fair enough. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. I think I saw a question in the chat room here. Okay, Islamic terrorism in the Congo. That's a really interesting one. In northern Congo, there indeed is a problem with Islamic terrorist groups, not indigenous to the Congo, but rather from Uganda and from Sudan. So out of Uganda, there's the Lord's Resistance Army. Out of Sudan, there's actually 3 different groups operating in northern Congo at the moment and committing atrocities, unfortunately, and obviously also impeding Congo's ability to attract investment. A Canadian gold mining company was attacked by the Lord's Resistance Army. A lot of the Congolese employees were killed on the spot, and 2 of the expats were taken hostage for ransom, which their company did pay. So they were released. But yes, there is a problem now with Islamic terrorism. But I would like to quickly mention also the flip side of that presence, because during the war, one of the areas that was initially most impacted was in Congo. And a certain province called Bunia province was just the epicenter of incredible levels of violence. And during that period, it was the mosques and the imams who stepped forward and who said, come in here, we'll protect you inside of our walls. And they saved hundreds of people. When the Catholic Church, and I'm a Catholic, when the Catholic Church wouldn't step up and confront the armies and offer sanctuary. That was the imams of the temples who did that. So yes, there's a terrorist issue, but there's also this wonderful example on the positive side as well. Let's see. Does U.S. investor knowledge of empathy give us a little edge for future success against investors from somewhere like China? Absolutely. Let me read that question a little more loudly just to make sure everyone sees it. Does U.S. investor knowledge of empathy give us a little edge for future success against investors from somewhere like China? Absolutely. Coming back to the aspect of empathy that I mentioned earlier that involves respect and confidence in someone else and that sense of shared values, 100%. You know, you read in the press a lot about the penetration of China in Africa and the strategic implications for US interests. And that's all 100% true. It's also maybe not 100% true, perhaps 50% true, that in many cases, those Chinese companies succeed by exploiting corruption in a very cynical way, because we all know corruption destroys countries and economies. But frequently, Chinese companies find it expedient to just accept it and say, hey, we're not here to argue about your value systems. If you want to be corrupt, be corrupt. We'll give you the suitcase full of money as long as you give us the contract. So initially, sometimes in certain countries, Congo being a good example, US companies find it harder to break into the market because we're not handing out suitcases full of money. We have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to make sure that our companies are not handing out suitcases full of money. But more importantly, over time, almost every African government has come to realize that the Chinese are exploiting corruption for their own interests. And that the US, in resisting the corruption, has demonstrated a shared remarkable value for human integrity and rights. Oops, my pussycat has come to help me get this right. She's from the Congo, my cat, so she knows what she's talking about. That has begun to turn the tide in favor of US companies on a global scale. On an individual company scale, human beings in Africa have demonstrated that they prefer to work for American companies because we do things that we consider simple and obvious, like providing training for our employees so that they can do their jobs better and more safely. By and large, Chinese don't do that. They bring in a lot of labor force from China, and mostly it's the less experienced jobs, what we would call menial labor, that is handed to the locals. So yes, the US is definitely gaining ground because of empathetic values. And I'm so happy to be able to say that that's true.
Other questions, comments, or contributions?
Or arguments, disagreements. You think I'm wrong. Okay, how does the African Union and soft powers like Morocco offer Congo a step toward rebuilding? The relationship with the African Union has always been complex, but given that next year the DRC will take the presidency of the African Union, I think that there's some hope that finally the AU will be able to help Congo make some substantive changes. We thought at first, when South Africa had the presidency of SADC, for instance, that would be a helpful element in stabilizing Congolese politics and encouraging intra-African investment in the Congo. But unfortunately, that did not work out. But I am hopeful for the African Union. And as I say, especially with Congo assuming the chair, I think that at last the AU might be able to do something. Morocco is a very interesting question. You obviously know something about the history of the Congo, or you wouldn't ask about Morocco. Morocco has been an on again, off again influencer in the Congo. Most of the time in a positive sense, but occasionally in a not so positive sense. They remain engaged in a very quiet way. The Key Foundation does a lot of very good work with schools, elementary schools, and providing IT equipment to the universities that I think is vital for the long-term economic advancement of the Congo. But I think that their political influence has waned a bit with Mr. Tshisekedi's regime, because Mr. Tshisekedi grew up in Belgium and is much more of a Eurocentric political leader rather than a Pan-African leader. So I would say that their influence has waned on that political level a little bit in the last 3 years.
Other questions?
Can I make a question? Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. Hi, how's it going? My name is
Good.
Chad Marver. I'm a senior. I am from Angola. And my question is, to what extent can the African Union help countries, for example, like Angola, which is where I'm from, to start rebuilding, to start making industries, because we have like the biggest age, it's people that are in their 30s. So it's people that can actually work, but they're not helping anything to the community, to the economic, because they're selling things in the street. And I see that that's a very common thing in Africa, where like people without any education, they're literally not contributing to the economy. Like they don't have good jobs that are helping the country grow. Like how can the African Union help to, bring foreign investors to start making industries, factories, so these people can actually make the economies for African countries grow? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fabulous question. It applies to Angola and to other member countries on the continent. The fundamental difficulty for the African Union is that kind of like the European Union, after which it was modeled, it lacks enforcement capability, short of draconian measures like, completely cutting a country off of membership or imposing, blockades or sanctions. Other than those kind of blunt instruments, it doesn't really have a lot of soft power. And that lack of persuasive capacity is a real impediment. We just saw, I'll come back to Angola in a second, but I'm going to go to a more extreme example on the continent. We just saw the coup in Mali, and the West African Economic Union and the AU mobilized quickly to send delegations to try to negotiate, a temporary return to the elected president, et cetera. And not highly successful in those endeavors. So when you come back to your question, which being based in economics is substantially more complicated, the AU's fundamental issue in the economic arena is what I would call an over-respect for sovereignty, and that is coupled with a lack of economic resources. So in other words, my vision for a powerful African Union would be one that itself controls an African investment fund into which, all of the countries which are capable, because let's face it, some countries, the poverty is so extreme, they're not capable, but every African country capable pays in a percentage annually. So you take Botswana, for instance, it has the Diamond Fund that they very wisely established when the British left, and into which De Beers has paid for in every year. And it's a multi-billion-dollar fund under professional management. So if Botswana and countries like Botswana, South Africa and others, if they all agreed to pay in a certain amount annually so that the African Union would have a stimulus fund, then that stimulus fund could be used together with the national government to try to establish, economic activity. I know that one of the aims of the current Angolan government is to have more rural industrial development. And that's the goal of many African countries, to try to find a way to provide livelihoods such that people will remain in rural areas and stop arriving in the capital cities, which are growing at unsupportable rates. So if the AU had an investment fund that could cooperate with the Angolan government in order to attract either Pan-African investors or US investors by providing matching investment funds and a guarantee, because after all, if the African Union is involved, then Angola is more likely to respect the contracts, more likely to respect the terms of engagement, then yes, I think the AU could play a really strong, interesting, energizing role for the entire continent. But I think that those two fundamental things have to change first, i.e. it needs to have a fund of this sort, and it also needs to have leverage. It needs to have something short of a nuclear bomb with which it can persuade nation states to reform themselves. And I want to just briefly touch on what you raised, the so-called gray market, because I'm a financial economist by training, and so I know exactly how hard it is to capture the true GDP value of countries where there are large gray markets, which is virtually all of the African continent and certain countries in Asia. Those countries, if they were able, as you said quite correctly, if they were able to capture that economic activity, GDP would increase. Ideally, taxation would increase. Ideally, government provided services would improve, and we would have the basis for launching a sustainable economic development cycle. Unfortunately, we're in the opposite kind of economic cycle, where investors are loath to come in. The infrastructure necessary, for instance, to support rural industrial development isn't present, where governments are either unwilling or unable to invest in that infrastructure, and therefore jobs are not created, not just in rural areas, but also in urban areas. And therefore, the rural population moves to the city to look for a job, doesn't find a job in the city either. See factor number one, investors being scared to come into the continent. And therefore, they wind up in the street selling loaves of bread or selling shoes or selling, depending on the time of year, insects for food, etc. And that negative cycle is perpetuated. So how do you break into that negative cycle? Partly by what I was just talking about. If the AU were able to play a more constructive Pan-African economic role and serve as the implicit guarantor for investors investing in African countries, I think that could actually begin to break the negative spiral that so many of the African economies are trapped in, where the economic activity is undervalued, where human worth is undervalued because we're not capturing that productivity, and where people, especially the young people, are increasingly dissatisfied. You have massive numbers of well-educated young Africans who graduating universities every year with essentially zero prospect of the kind of job for which they studied. And I'm sure every one of you on this call can sympathize with that, how frustrating that is, how frustrating it makes you feel. And eventually frustration leads to anger. I really worry that across the continent, there's a ticking time bomb of a very youthful, underemployed, and increasingly restless population.
Thank you, Tara. Excellent question. Others, we still have a little time left if there are other questions. Mel, let me ask you in a general, but I think important sense, when we talk about the concept of empathy, where do you think this comes from? I mean, I'm just absolutely sure that having empathy is so critical in terms of any kind of international engagement. I think it should come naturally and be sincere, that you're interested in other people, that you have an interest in the heritage of other people, mutual respect, a sense of connection as a human being, and experiencing similar kinds of feelings and life experience. But I'll have to tell you, in the entire time I was in the UCLA PhD program in international politics and security over several years, I do not remember a single time in a seminar where we talked about the concept of empathy. We were talking about power, we were talking about force, we were talking about coercive engagement, things like this. So what we're suggesting in a way may be so fundamental, but somehow hasn't been a part of the educational experience. I mean, I could talk about the schools of international relations and security for our colleagues that are here in business. I mean, are you talking about empathy in educational programs in global business? Is it something that we learn, when I think back on it, did I really learn this in the educational experience, or was it more about my parents, my family, the people that you were raised with? What is how do you see this? Where does the sincere sense of empathy come from in a person? And we're at this threshold of transition in our society. Maybe we are evolving toward better ways of doing things, better ways of engaging with one another globally. What do you see as a sort of source of empathy, and how can we cultivate it more in our society?
Fabulous. I love that. I will, without hesitation, tell you that empathy starts at home with your parents and your family. And I think that's one reason that globally empathy is seen as a female characteristic much more so than a male characteristic. Because if you look at how we're still raising children, by and large, again, obviously exceptions. I'm coming to my personal story in a minute, and it was an exception. But globally speaking, we're still teaching our boys that real men don't cry, suck it up. It's important to be a winner. Don't be a loser. And we're teaching girls that it's important to understand how they feel and why they feel the way they feel, and what can I do to make them feel better, and how can I help? Those sentences convey a very stark difference in how we're forming our gendered children. And we're still not teaching our men that empathy is a valuable commodity to have. That's why this discussion of empathy as a tool for business success is so important. Why, similarly, why empathy as a political tool is so important for success, because we need to reach all of the parents and all of the men who are still being told likewise. So I'm going to tell you my story. I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. And when I grew up, Cincinnati was officially a segregated city. We had those neighborhoods where Black people lived, and they did their thing. That's where they lived, and they didn't come to the other neighborhoods unless, you know, somebody was maid or somebody was a garbage collector or something of that sort. And people just kind of accepted that. We had the Ku Klux Klan. I grew up with all of that. I grew up with all that ugliness that all of America has so recently been exposed to. I grew up with that. And within my family, my cousins were raised very differently than I was, and used, you know, the N-word and so forth routinely. Didn't think twice about it. I was raised by my parents to believe that if you must judge someone, then judge them by what they do, not by how they look, not even by what they say. Judge them by what they do. Preferably don't judge people at all. And I was encouraged to find friends who didn't look like me. And that wasn't easy back in those days in Cincinnati. But when I was a girl, I had a Japanese girlfriend, and eventually I had a Black girlfriend, and they were welcomed into our house. And I will tell you, I remember one of our neighbors being very upset seeing my Black girlfriend come to dinner. I think something was said to my parents, and I'm quite sure my parents had something to say to those people in response. So that's why, without hesitation, I say that it comes from parenting and it comes from home. And that's what I was getting at when I said that it comes from understanding your family and the values that your family has. And sometimes it requires people to make that difficult choice of abandoning some of those values because maybe they weren't quite correct. I mean, I'm thinking about my cousins, right? It's not their fault that they were raised in a way that was not respectful and not empathetic in any way. So that's not their fault. But as adults, they have a choice to change. They have a choice to look at the values that they were handed and ask themselves, are those really positive? Are those really helpful? Are those really helping me to live a full and rich life? And I think a large part of what we're seeing right now playing out in our nation is a lot of people have suddenly been forced to take a look at that question for themselves. Why do I believe what I believe? Why do I believe that Black people somehow aren't the same as me? Why do I believe that? They're being forced by circumstances to ask themselves, is what I was taught correct? And that brings me at last to the point, Cheryl, that you mentioned at the beginning. It's not being widely taught now, but I am convinced that it is going to be central material for universities going forward. Because what we're seeing is that as a society, we cannot survive and flourish without empathy.
Well, I think that's a very important note maybe to conclude. And I want to thank you, Mel. That was really interesting. And to thank all of those who are attending here. I hope we can continue this discussion in 2021. I think the initiative here of coming together and exchanging perspectives and having the benefit of expertise such as Mel today, that she could bring her experience is very valuable for all of us and helps to move our national and global dialogue and understanding forward. So Mel, thank you so much. And thank you to the World Affairs Council and our colleagues here. Rania Lewis, thank you for all you're doing for this initiative. And we'll see you all in 2021. Please stay safe and take care. And thank you.
Thank y'all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.